all, and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and another dip into the archive. Last year, 2022, I did a 4-part video series on the St. Johns, Florida's longest and most important river. I suppose this is part 5. Today I'm taking a look at the car ferries that cross the St. Johns. That may not sound exciting, but it's an interesting part of the state's history and plays a role in its tourism industry. More than 100 years ago, there were dozens of ferries throughout Florida. We're a state with many rivers and a long coastline, 1,350 miles or 2,170 kilometers in fact. More than half of the state's coastline is protected by barrier islands, most of which were serviced by ferries in the past, just like they are with bridges today. There's over 160 bridges to connect the mainland to the many islands, including some 30 just in the Keys. Many of those bridges replaced ferries, as did bridges crossing Florida's rivers such as Swanee, Caloosahatchee, Apalachicola, St. Lucie, and of course the St. Johns. Eventually all of Florida's car ferries stopped operating, except for 3 on the St. Johns. For unique reasons, these 3 will remain for the foreseeable future. So let's take a look at the ferries, their history, and their connection with Florida tourism. I'll start with the southernmost ferry. Known for its destination, it connects the small community of Georgetown on the east side of the river to Drayton Island, which lies at the north end of Lake George, the state's second largest lake. Drayton is the only island of note on the St. Johns and has been inhabited for several thousand years, first by indigenous tribes including the Timucua, and later as a plantation beginning in the 1760s. It's 2.5 square miles, or about 7 square kilometers in size, and has about 40 homes on it. The ferry travels only about 1/4 of a mile, or under half a kilometer, to provide the only public access to the island. It can fit a couple of cars on it and typically operates 3 times a day, but can accommodate other trips. It's comprised of a small barge with a connected tugboat and is operated by Putnam County. The ferry service began in 1943, though residents of the island have been asking for a ferry for a number of years. Many of the residents today have their own boats, so the ferry isn't used as much as one might think. In the last couple years, the Florida Department of Transportation managed a $3.1 million reconstruction project at both of the ferry's landings. It included reconstructing the ferry slips and replacing a boat ramp at Georgetown. Drayton Island is named after William Drayton Sr., a Chief Justice of British East Florida and later a U.S. District Judge. Florida became British property in 1763, and it was at this point that the settlement of the territory began in earnest. Drayton, who had moved from the colony of South Carolina, purchased the island and had his slaves develop a cotton and orange plantation. It's unclear how many enslaved people worked on the plantation, but Drayton's family owned over 100 plantations, so they were one of the largest slave owners in the colonies, with numbers of slaves in the thousands. In 1783, at the end of the American Revolution, Florida would be returned to Spain, and the Drayton Island plantation would be taken over by Zephaniah Kingsley, who was yet another major Florida landowner and slaver. He not only owned and captained slave ships which brought thousands of Africans to the Americas, he was a supplier of well-trained slaves, many of whom were smuggled into Georgia and South Carolina. Kingsley cultivated oranges on the island, and the slaves built long, sturdy docks deep into Lake George so steamboats from Jacksonville could load his produce for shipment up north and overseas. Drayton Island stayed in the Kingsley family until sometime around 1830. The Spanish would cede Florida to the U.S. in 1821, and the settlement of the territory would shift into overdrive. By the 1830s, Drayton Island would be a scheduled stop for tourists traveling on steamboats that plied the river between Jacksonville and Sanford. Today, the island is a residential neighborhood. Much of it is undeveloped. For example, 30 acres at the northernmost tip of the island were donated to the Archaeological Conservancy in 2011. Founded in 1980, the Conservancy is an organization that preserves archaeologically significant properties throughout the U.S. On the Drayton property is the Walraven Shell Midden. The site has been the home of prehistoric communities for at least 2,000 years, between about 500 BCE to when the Spanish arrived around 1565. A midden is a mound that contains the debris of human activity, particularly the shells of thousands of mollusks that were collected for food, but also includes animal bones and potsherds. The Walraven Midden is part of the St. John's culture that flourished along the river and the Atlantic coast. The Archaeological Conservancy told me that as of yet, very little research has been done there, and there's no current plans for excavations. The Georgetown Landing is named for Eddie Babbitt Jr., a Georgetown native who operated the ferry between 1972 and 2009. Babbitt, who served in the Army during the Korean War, was an electrical contractor by profession and a charter member of the Georgetown Fruitland Volunteer Fire Department, including serving as its president. He died in 2013 and was known affectionately as the Mayor of Georgetown. Located less than 4 miles or 6 kilometers north of Drayton Island is the second ferry crossing, and this one fully crosses the St. John's, connecting the Mount Royal area with the Ocala National Forest. Known as the Fort Gates Ferry, it's named for the Second Seminole War U.S. Army fort that was built nearby. The war, part of America's longest, deadliest, and costliest war against indigenous people, began because the U.S. voided a treaty and demanded that all Seminoles relocate to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. The fort was named for Lieutenant Colonel William Gates, who served in Florida during the war. Gates was considered a fine soldier even though he was court-martialed for cowardice and arrested Seminole Chief Osceola while the chief was attending peace negotiations. The war happened between 1835 and 1842, with Fort Gates established near the start of the war. Once it had ended and the Seminole people had either been forced to move to Indian Territory or were pushed into the southern part of Florida, new settlers began to move into Central Florida, and in 1853 the ferry was established. It's the oldest continuously operating ferry in the state at 170 years. Ocala National Forest lies on the west side of the river. It's the oldest national forest east of the Mississippi River, encompasses 607 square miles or 1,570 square kilometers, and protects the world's largest scrub pine forest. The ferry's west landing meets a graded dirt road managed by the Forest Service. During the Civil War, the local Confederate militia used the ferry to run supplies and troops across to St. John's. Since 1914, the ferry consists of a small barge pushed by a tugboat converted from a 1910 Sharpie sailboat. The barge is similar to the Drayton Island one, while the tug, named Two Wendy, is 18 feet or 5.5 meters long. In 1968, it sunk in the wake of Hurricane Gladys, but it was raised and continues to operate. It was Two Wendy that would star in a TV commercial in 1983. This didn't make the ferry famous, however, at least not in the U.S., because it was filmed to promote the Nissan Skyline car and only shown in Japan. While it was a Japanese commercial, the ad featured the American film actor Paul Newman along with the Fort Gates Ferry.
I've been trying to get to you for long.
Mr. Newman, what's the car's name?
It's a Skyline. You want to check it out?
I've been thinking about a shortcut that I could take.
Skyline is terrific.
I need you before it's too late.
愛のスカイラインに50スペシャル2登場。
The commercial was part of the Skyline's 25th anniversary year, and Newman was hired for the series of 14 ads because of his connection with Nissan. He was an award-winning actor in such movies as The Hustler, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, and Road to Perdition. Having been nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actor 8 times, he received the Oscar for the 1988 movie Color of Money. Newman was also successful at auto racing, turning professional in 1972. Throughout much of his racing career, he drove Nissan race cars, which is referenced in some of the Skyline ads. Nissan even released a Paul Newman version of the Skyline to accompany the commercials. If you're interested, I've made a companion video that shows the 14 commercials which feature Newman. By the way, this wasn't the only time that Paul Newman appeared on film in connection to the Sunshine State. Absence of Malice is a 1981 film directed by Sidney Pollack and starring Paul Newman, Sally Field, and Wilford Brimley. And the 1967 movie Cool Hand Luke, directed by Stuart Rosenberg and starring Newman and George Kennedy, took place in a Florida prison work camp. Even though it was filmed in California, the movie locations are convincing as the rural area around Fort Gates. In yet another link to auto racing, in 2009, Quaker State, the motor oil brand, created a promotion called Quaker State's World's Worst Commute Contest. They let NASCAR driver Jimmy Johnson, a 7-time NASCAR Cup Series champion, pick the winner. He chose Kimberly Hansen of Salt Springs, a small community just southwest of the ferry. Hansen's commute consisted of a bumpy ride in her Jeep over a 7-mile washboard dirt road where she sometimes got stuck in mud or sugar sand. Along the way, she took the ferry, sometimes waiting 30 minutes to cross the river. After crossing, she drove another 11 miles to her job. Selecting a winner was not an easy task, said Johnson, but when it came down to it, Hansen was the clear winner. Though it's not the same kind of driving I'm used to, it's clear why her commute deserves the title of World's Worst Commute. When Hurricane Irma ran through Florida in 2017, the storm damaged both the ferry and the East Landing, which forced the suspension of the service. In 2019, the Putnam County Commission authorized funds for repairing the ferry landing. As of early 2023, the wooden part of the landing has been repaired and a new ramp was built, but the ramp still needs to be installed and inspected. The Florida Department of Transportation is responsible for performing inspections on bridge structures and ferry landings for state and local roads. FDOT inspection teams make repair recommendations based on field conditions, and then the inspection reports and recommendations are sent to the local owners for their records and completion of the recommended repairs. At this point, Putnam County and FDOT haven't released a date for when the repairs will be completed. The 170-year-old Fort Gates Ferry is still needed due to the fact that it saves up to 50 miles or 80 kilometers of driving. The two closest bridges, in Astor and Palatka, create a gap that is nearly 1/5 the entire length of the river. The final car ferry can be found just outside Jacksonville and only a short distance from the mouth of the river. Known as the St. Johns River Ferry, it travels the short distance between the town of Mayport and Fort George Island. The ferry connects the two segments of State Road A1A, the historic oceanfront road which runs from Key West to Fernandina Beach. Even though A1A crosses over 100 bridges, including 42 just to get from Key West to Miami, you need the ferry to stay on the road and get to the end of A1A. There's been a ferry there since 1874. While the trip is short, barely 5 minutes, it's a popular ride for commuters and tourists alike. The current ferry is the Jean Ribault, which was built in 1996 and holds 40 vehicles. It replaced the Blackbeard, built in 1956, which handled 42 vehicles, and the Jean Lafitte, which was a 26-car ferry. Lafitte was a French pirate and privateer who operated in the Gulf of Mexico in the early 19th century. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, was an English pirate who operated around the West Indies and Britain's North American colonies. Jean Ribault was a French naval officer, navigator, and a colonizer of what would become the coastal southern U.S., including Florida. You can learn more about his story in this video. The Florida Department of Transportation operated the service until 2006, when Governor Charlie Crist cut its budget. The city of Jacksonville had been assisting with funds, and they took over its operation. Later, the city found that they couldn't afford the costs, so Jacksonville Port Authority began to run it in 2007. In 2016, the Jacksonville Transportation Authority took over ownership of the ferry. There's a couple fun facts that I mentioned in my earlier video about the St. John's. If you're driving north to reach Fernandina Beach, you end up further south when you've taken the ferry, as the Mayport landing is north of the Fort George landing. Also, when you drive onto the ferry, you've entered the Timucuan Ecological and Historic Preserve, which is part of the National Park Service. While it's operated by the Jacksonville Transportation Authority, the ferry is officially a part of the preserve, and sometimes a park ranger is on board to answer questions. In the 1950s and 60s, the ferry was part of the Buccaneer Trail, one of Florida's scenic routes like the Orange Blossom Trail and the Dixie Highway. Running from Callahan in the north to Daytona Beach in the south, as the brochure stated, the Buccaneer Trail allowed tourists to glide swiftly down the northeast Florida coast and bypass Jacksonville's congested traffic. The trail was sponsored by the Ocean Highway and Port Authority. It offered this souvenir map on simulated parchment for $1. Illustrated by Warner Sanford, an artist with the Florida Highway Department, and published by Ralph Odom, a state assistant attorney general, the popularity of the map helped to increase the amount of treasure hunting in the state, boosting the number of permits sought by treasure seekers. Original copies of the map currently sell for about $300. These three ferries offer unique glimpses into Florida's nature and history. The Drayton Island and Fort Gates ferries are in a rural part of the St. John's that is little changed from 150 years ago, sitting alongside the Ocala National Forest. On the other hand, the St. John's River Ferry is in the midst of a large metropolitan area, a busy port, a major Navy base, and many sites that form a large part of Florida history since the 16th century. While in most situations a bridge is a more cost-effective and convenient alternative to a ferry, for each of these locations a bridge isn't going to be in the cards anytime soon. The St. Johns River is navigable by fairly large boats south to Sanford, so both Fort Gates and Drayton Island would require expensive tall bridges that wouldn't be worth the amount of traffic. The St. Johns River Ferry is nestled between Mayport Naval Station and the Timucuan Ecological and Historical Preserve, so there's little room for approaches to a potential bridge. So that's a look at the three car ferries in the state. I'm sure I'll be back on the St. John's soon. I have planned a video on some of its tributaries, and I hope to get to that this year. Let me know what parts of the St. John's area you're most interested in. Thank you for watching another of my videos. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to learn more about Florida's tourism history. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.